Psalm 2. The forge of inner sovereignty and the revolt against chaos. There comes a crucial moment in the human journey when a person awakens to the consciousness of their own existence, not as a biological accident, not as a passive product of circumstances, but as a deliberate force and intentional presence in the universe. This moment does not arrive as sudden enlightenment or mystical revelation, but as the inevitable confrontation with a disturbing reality. The external world constantly conspires against the integrity of the self. Social structures, collective expectations, economic pressures, cultural patterns, all converge in a concentric movement that seeks to dissolve individual identity into a collective broth of conformity. It is at this precise point of maximum tension between the emerging self and external chaos that Psalm 2 positions its archetypal narrative. It is not a text about ancient politics or abstract theology, but a psychological map that describes with surgical precision the process through which individual consciousness emerges from collective dissolution and establishes its internal sovereignty against all forces that seek to deny it. The psalm opens with a devastatingly simple question. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The question does not seek a factual answer, but functions as a rhetorical device that forces the listener to confront the absurd nature of humanity's rebellion against the established order. But here lies the first deep psychological inversion the text performs. The rebellion described is not against tyranny or injustice, but against the very structure of meaning that makes ordered existence possible. The nations and kings conspire against the Anointed One, against the one who represents divine order, the organizing principle that prevents total collapse into primordial chaos. In modern psychological terms, the psalm describes the movement by which collective consciousness, when not anchored in transcendent principles, inevitably degenerates into fragmentation, violence, and self-destruction. Left to themselves, crowds do not spontaneously construct civilization. They regress into the Hobbesian state of a war of all against all. To understand the archaeopsychological depth of this text, we must return to the historical context of its composition, not as a sterile academic exercise, but as a method for recovering layers of meaning accumulated through millennia of human experience. Psalm 2 belongs to the category of royal psalms, texts composed to celebrate the coronation or legitimization of Israelite kings, likely used in liturgical ceremonies in the Jerusalem temple. The precise dating remains a subject of scholarly debate, with proposals ranging from the Davidic period to the post-exilic era, but the internal structure suggests origin within an established monarchy, when Israel already possessed a sufficiently developed tradition of sacral kingship. What matters here is not absolute historical precision, but the recognition that this text emerges from a culture that had developed a sophisticated political theology in which the human king functioned as mediator between divine order and earthly reality, as a living axis mundi connecting heaven and earth, transcendence and immanence. Ancient Israelite civilization, unlike its imperial neighbors, developed a unique concept of limited monarchy, where the king remained subordinate to divine law and the communal covenant. This political innovation was not a mere historical accident, but the logical consequence of a deeper theological revolution. Ethical monotheism, which positioned a single transcendent deity as the ultimate source of all authority. In surrounding cultures, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Canaanite, the king was often deified or considered the literal son of the gods, exercising absolute and arbitrary power. In Israel, the king was anointed, chosen, but remained human, subject to prophetic critique and moral responsibility. This seemingly technical distinction carries monumental psychological implications. It establishes the principle that legitimate authority derives not from brute force or military conquest, but from alignment with a transcendent order of meaning and justice. The Israelite king was not a god, but God's representative, and his legitimacy depended on how faithfully he embodied divine principles of justice, mercy, and truth. Psalm 2 operates within this theological political framework, but its genius lies in how it transcends historical particularities to articulate universal psychological truths. When the text describes nations raging and kings conspiring against the Lord's anointed, it is not merely recording a specific political event, but encoding an archetypal pattern that repeats endlessly in human experience. The rebellion of chaos against order, of dissolution against structure, of the dispersed many against the integrated one. In every individual who seeks to develop a coherent identity, this drama replays itself. The internal voices of doubt, shame, resentment, envy, all conspire against the emerging center of personality, seeking to fragment, dissolve, and reduce it back to the primitive state of undifferentiated potential. The person who seeks to establish personal values, develop authentic character, and build a life of meaning and purpose inevitably encounters resistance not only externally from social pressures and expectations, but internally from their own regressive and disintegrative tendencies. This psychological interpretation illuminates why the psalm resonates so powerfully across cultures and centuries. It is not merely a religious text of a specific tradition, but a precise mapping of universal structures of human consciousness. Carl Jung described a similar process in his theory of individuation, the path by which the ego differentiates itself from the collective unconscious and establishes autonomous identity while remaining connected to transpersonal sources of meaning. The anointed one of Psalm 2 functions as the symbol of what Jung would call the self, the archetypal center of the total personality that both transcends and integrates the conscious ego. The rebellion of the nations represents the chaotic forces of the personal and collective unconscious resisting the emergence of this higher organizing structure. Thus, the drama described in the psalm is the drama of human consciousness itself struggling to emerge and remain coherent against forces that constantly threaten to dissolve it. The structure of Psalm 2 reveals remarkable literary sophistication that reinforces its psychological content. The text divides into 4 clearly demarcated sections, each presenting a different perspective on the central conflict. The first presents the problem, the rebellion of the nations against the anointed. The second shifts to the divine perspective, revealing how God laughs at the conspirators and affirms his choice of the king in Zion. The third gives voice to the anointed himself, who proclaims the divine decree of his sonship and universal authority. The fourth offers a final exhortation to the kings of the earth to submit wisely before it is too late. This quadripartite structure is not aesthetic ornamentation, but a deliberate method of presenting the conflict from multiple angles, forcing the listener to confront the reality of all perspectives involved. The first section, with its rhetorical question about the futility of human rebellion, establishes a tone of almost comic incredulity before the arrogance of the nations. Why do they rebel? The question implies the fundamental absurdity of their action, as if asking why someone would destroy their own house while still living in it. The kings of the earth rise, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, "Let us break their chains and throw off their cords." The language is of slavery and liberation, but reversed. The conspirators perceive divine order as a prison from which they must escape. This is a profound psychological insight into the nature of human rebellion. We experience structure, limit, and law not as necessary conditions for flourishing, but as arbitrary restrictions upon imagined infinite freedom. The teenager rebels against parental authority, not necessarily because it is unjust, but because the mere existence of authority offends their emerging sense of autonomy. Likewise, collective consciousness often turns against the ordering principles that make civilization possible, because these principles demand discipline, sacrifice, and the subordination of immediate impulses to long-term goals. This psychological dynamic manifests differently across socioeconomic strata, but the fundamental pattern remains constant. For individuals living in extreme poverty, rebellion against the established order may seem not only justified, but necessary for survival. When existing social structures perpetuate misery, hunger, and violence, revolt carries evident moral legitimacy. But Psalm 2 operates at a deeper level than specific social critique. It does not ask whether we should reform unjust structures, but whether we can exist without structure at all. The revolt condemned is not against particular tyranny, but against the very principle of transcendent order. It is the nihilistic fantasy that we could discard all chains, all cords, all limitation, and still maintain meaningful existence. This fantasy is equally destructive when embraced by the poor who imagine that violent revolution will spontaneously create utopia, by the middle class dreaming of escape from all responsibilities, or by the wealthy believing that material abundance exempts them from moral obligation. The second section introduces a dramatic shift in perspective that is key to its psychological impact. After describing the conspiracy of the nations, the text suddenly transports us to the divine viewpoint. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. This is one of the most disturbing and provocative images in biblical literature. God laughs, not with benevolent joy or paternal mercy, but with scorn, mocking the futility of human pretensions. The image unsettles because it confronts our inflated self-importance. Our grand conspiracies, dramatic revolutions, ideological manifestos, all appear from the transcendent perspective as the tantrums of children who believe they can defy gravity simply by refusing to accept it. The divine laughter is not cruelty, but recognition of the comical disproportion between human ambition and ontological reality. It is as if the very structure of the universe finds amusing our belief that we could reconfigure it according to our preferences. This divine laughter can be interpreted psychologically as the voice of maturity confronting the illusions of perpetual adolescence. Part of psychological development involves recognizing that the universe is not organized around our desires, that real and unyielding limits exist against which we struggle in vain. Maturity requires accepting these limits not as defeat, but as the structure within which genuine freedom becomes possible. The child who never learns that they cannot have everything they want becomes an adult who is either a tyrant or a perpetual victim, oscillating between narcissistic demand and impotent collapse. The mature person recognizes limits as conditions for genuine creativity. The artist creates not despite, but because of the limitations of the medium. The writer finds a unique voice within the constraints of language. The musician discovers harmony by navigating acoustic laws. Rebellion against all limitation is not freedom, but dissolution into formless chaos. But the text does not remain with laughter. Divine response escalates. Then he speaks to them in his wrath and terrifies them in his fury. The progression from laughter to wrath marks a crucial transition. What begins as comic absurdity becomes existential threat. There is a time when rebellion against order can be tolerated as benign immaturity, but beyond a certain point it invokes catastrophic consequences. Psychologically, this corresponds to the difference between youthful experimentation and pathological self-destruction. The adolescent who tests boundaries is healthy. The adult who continues rejecting all structure walks toward psychological fragmentation. The divine wrath represents not arbitrary punishment, but the natural consequences of living against the structure of reality. You may rebel against gravity, but eventually you fall. You may rebel against the need for meaning, but eventually you collapse into nihilism. You may rebel against the demands of authentic relationships, but eventually you end up isolated and empty. For people living in socioeconomic marginalization, this message may seem especially harsh. Someone struggling to survive with precarious employment, unstable housing, and limited access to education or healthcare may reasonably ask why they should accept a structure that appears to perpetuate their suffering. But the psalm is not defending social injustice or passive accommodation to oppression. It asserts a deeper truth. There is no escape from the need for structure as such. The question is not whether we will have order, but what kind of order we choose to align with. Rebellion that merely destroys without building a superior alternative liberates no one. It simply replaces one form of chaos with another. History is full of revolutions that promised liberation but delivered new tyranny because they lacked transcendent ordering vision and possessed only reactive negation. Authentic social transformation requires not the rejection of order, but the struggle to align social structures with more just and humane principles. This requires not less structure, but better structure, not the absence of authority, but genuinely legitimate authority. The third section gives voice to the anointed. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Here we find the theological and psychological core of the text. The king proclaims his identity not as personal achievement or biological accident, but as divine declaration. You are my son. This affirmation of divine sonship carries dense layers of meaning resonating across religious traditions and psychological systems. In ancient Israel, it marks the king as God's chosen representative endowed with authority to govern in the divine name. But the phrase "today I have begotten you" introduces a crucial element. This sonship is not an eternal biological fact, but an event that occurs at a specific moment, today. The begetting happens at the coronation, at the instant when the human assumes the sacralized role. This suggests that identity is not simply a given, but a reality that must be established, declared, and assumed. Psychologically, this divine begetting corresponds to what we might call the birth of the authentic consciousness. We are not born with fully formed identity, but with potentiality that must be actualized through a complex developmental process. The self we become is not merely the product of genetics and environment, but emerges through deliberate choices, commitments, and adopted values. The moment when a person decides who they will be, what principles will guide their life, what legacy they seek to build, is the moment of begetting, the real birth of the authentic self. The declaration "you are my son" can be read as recognition that our deepest identity is not an arbitrary creation of the ego, but a connection to something that transcends us, a source of meaning and value that we do not invent, but discover. In traditional religious language, this is relationship with God. In modern psychological language, it is the connection to transpersonal dimensions of the psyche, to the archetypes that structure universal human experience. The proclamation continues, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery." The language is of total dominion and absolute power. The nations that conspire against the anointed will be subdued not by negotiation, but by irresistible force. The image of the iron rod smashing clay vessels is violent and unsettling. How do we reconcile this with contemporary values of tolerance, pluralism, and respect for diversity? The key is recognizing that the psalm operates on a symbolic level, not a literal one. The subjugation of the nations represents the integration of chaotic and rebellious elements of the psyche under the rule of a conscious organizing center. The process of individuation and mature psychological development necessarily involves subordination of contradictory impulses, the disciplining of destructive tendencies, and the organization of the multiplicity of inner experience under a hierarchy of consciously chosen values. This subordination is not inner tyranny, but its opposite, the condition for real freedom. A person dominated by uncontrolled contradictory impulses is not free, but enslaved to momentary whims. The alcoholic who cannot resist the desire to drink is not free, but prisoner to compulsion. The chronically anxious person who cannot regulate emotions is not free, but hostage to neurotic reactivity. Authentic freedom emerges only when we develop the capacity to govern ourselves, to subordinate immediate impulses to long-term purposes, to align behavior with consciously chosen values. This is the iron rod of the integrated self, not an instrument of oppression, but of necessary order. And when the text says the nations will be smashed like pottery, it acknowledges that some psychological patterns, some destructive behavioral structures, cannot be reformed gradually, but must be dismantled completely. The addict cannot moderate moderately. They must sever entirely. The person in an abusive relationship cannot negotiate gently. They must enact radical rupture. There are moments when decisive force is not only appropriate, but indispensable. For individuals navigating socioeconomic mobility, this message of inner sovereignty has urgent relevance. The person born into poverty who seeks to build a different life faces not only material obstacles, but deep psychological and cultural ones. There are internalized voices whispering that you do not deserve success, that you must stay in your place, that ambition is betrayal. There are behavioral patterns learned in environments of scarcity that become maladaptive in contexts of opportunity. There is generational trauma transmitted through epigenetics and family modeling. Breaking from all this requires the exercise of the inner strength symbolized by Psalm 2. Wanting change is not enough. One must establish sovereignty over the inner world, subdue the voices of self-sabotage, and shatter patterns that prevent growth. This does not happen through shallow positive thinking or empty affirmations, but through honest confrontation with internal and external realities, disciplined work of psychological reconstruction, and inflexible commitment to consciously chosen values. Similarly, for the middle class often trapped in the golden cage of mediocre comfort, The psalm challenges one to establish sovereignty over life rather than simply drifting along the path of least resistance. It is tempting to accept work that pays the bills but does not feed the soul, to remain in a stable but passionless relationship, to live a respectable but inauthentic life. The iron rod here signifies the courage to shatter the illusion of security that is in fact a prison, to break from social expectations that suffocate true identity, to reclaim authority over one's own existence. And for the upper class, the challenge is even more subtle yet no less urgent. Recognizing that material privilege does not confer automatic meaning, that excessive comfort can act as anesthetic preventing real development, that power without transcendent purpose is empty. The inner sovereignty proclaimed by the psalm is not a function of external status, but of internal alignment with a source of meaning that transcends all circumstances. The psalm's final section assumes an urgent tone of exhortation. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The language mixes warning and promise, threat and invitation. There is a window of opportunity, but it does not remain open indefinitely. The kings who conspired against the anointed may still submit, may still recognize their folly and align with reality, but time is limited. His wrath can flare up in a moment. Psychologically, this corresponds to the fact that destructive patterns, if not confronted, eventually reach a point of no return. The person who ignores signs of illness until it becomes terminal, the relationship that decays until resentment becomes irreversible, the career that drifts until recovery becomes impossible, all illustrate the truth that time is limited and consequences of persistent refusal eventually become irreversible. Yet the exhortation is not purely threatening. It is also inviting. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. This phrase captures the central paradox of mature existence, the combination of reverence and joy, fear and celebration. Submission to transcendent order is not degrading humiliation, but liberating recognition of reality. When we stop fighting the structure of the universe and learn to navigate within it, we discover not constriction but creativity, not imprisonment, but possibility. The fear mentioned is not paralyzing terror, but reverent respect before the mystery and magnitude of existence. It is the attitude that acknowledges that we are not the center of the universe, that forces and realities infinitely greater than us exist, and that wisdom consists in aligning with them rather than presuming to subdue them. Yet this fear coexists with joy precisely because release from the unbearable burden of having to be God, of having to sustain the universe by our own strength, is profoundly liberating. The phrase kiss the Son is particularly intriguing because the term translated as son appears in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, raising complex textual issues debated extensively by scholars. Some propose textual emendation. Others defend the reading as it stands. The traditional interpretation understands it as a command to submit to the anointed, recognizing his authority through a gesture of homage. In the ancient Near East, the kiss was often an act of political vassalage, a recognition of suzerainty. To kiss the Son is to accept his sovereignty, align with his authority, abandon rebellion, and enter into proper relationship with the established order. Psychologically, this corresponds to the crucial movement of accepting reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be, of subordinating personal will to principles recognized as legitimately superior, of integrating the conscious ego with the transpersonal center of the personality. The psalm concludes with a promise: blessed are all who take refuge in him. After all the language of rebellion, wrath, subjugation, iron rods, and shattered pottery, the text ends with a surprisingly tender image of refuge. Those who align with the anointed find not exposure and vulnerability, but protection and security. This is a profound psychological insight. Genuine inner strength is not defensive rigidity, but flexibility rooted in a stable center. The person who has established inner sovereignty does not need to defend it compulsively, because it is grounded in connection to something greater than the ego. There is a paradox running through wisdom literature. We find strength through appropriate surrender, security through trust, autonomy through recognition of fundamental dependence. This is not capitulation or weakness, but the maturity of recognizing that we exist in a web of relationships, that absolute autonomy is adolescent illusion, and that mature interdependence is the condition for human flourishing. To fully understand how Psalm 2 functions as a technology of psychological transformation, we must explore it not only as an ancient text, but as a ritual performance originally enacted in liturgical context. The psalm was not primarily read silently or studied academically, but sung, dramatized, and embodied in a coronation ceremony that transformed an ordinary citizen into a sacralized king. This performative dimension is crucial because it indicates that the text was designed to produce a transformative effect in participants, facilitating the transition from one state of consciousness to another. The person who entered the ceremony as David the shepherd left it as David the anointed king. Something happened in the ritual process that was not merely a legal change in status, but a reconfiguration of identity at a profound level. Modern studies in neuroscience and ritual psychology reveal that structured ceremonies, especially those involving multiple sensory elements such as music, movement, and recitation, can facilitate altered states of consciousness in which new structures of meaning are more readily integrated into the personality. Psalm 2, when sung in a coronation context with all its pomp and dramatic force, was not merely describing reality, but performing reality. The proclamation, "You are my son," was not an observation about an already existing fact, but a performative declaration that created what it affirmed. In modern terms, we might say that the ritual provided a symbolic framework within which new identity could be assumed and integrated. This understanding has profound practical implications for contemporary application. We do not need a sacralized monarchy to benefit from the psychological wisdom encoded in the psalm. Each of us faces transitional moments in which we must assume a new identity, a new role, a new level of responsibility. A person becoming a parent for the first time, a professional stepping into a leadership position, a student graduating and entering the adult world, an individual overcoming addiction and rebuilding life, all face the necessity of a symbolic death of the previous identity and the birth of a new self. Psalm 2 offers a map for this transition. It recognizes that there will be resistance, both internal and external. Voices of self-sabotage will conspire against the emerging new self. There will be the temptation to return to the familiar, even when the familiar is dysfunctional. There will be moments of doubt as to whether we are truly capable of sustaining the new identity. But the psalm insists that if we anchor the transition in connection with something that transcends us, in alignment with principles we recognize as true and good, then we can navigate this passage successfully. The practical application of the psalm for developing inner strength begins with honest recognition of our current condition. What chaotic forces, internal or external, conspire against our integrity? What voices tell us that we are not enough, that we do not deserve success, that we must remain small and safe? What behavioral patterns, inherited from family or culture, keep us trapped in destructive cycles? The first task is to name these forces clearly. You cannot subdue an enemy you refuse to acknowledge exists. This requires a practice of honest self-examination that may be painful. We must confront not only external circumstances that limit us, but also our own complicity in maintaining those limitations. We often discover that we are our own jailers, that we have built elaborate psychological prisons and then blamed others for our imprisonment. The second movement is to establish a connection with a source of authority and meaning that transcends the ego. This may take a traditional religious form for those who possess faith, or it may be expressed in secular terms as a commitment to values we recognize as objectively valid: truth, justice, beauty, love, courage, integrity. The crucial point is that these values are not merely arbitrary personal preferences, but realities that have legitimate claims upon us. When we say truth is better than falsehood, we are not merely expressing personal taste, but acknowledging a principle that transcends individual convenience. Establishing conscious and deliberate connection with such principles provides an anchor that enables us to withstand storms of circumstance and emotion. This is the contemporary equivalent of the declaration, "You are my son." We are not arbitrary creations of blind forces, but carriers of potential that has intrinsic dignity and meaning. The third movement is to assume authority over one's own development. This means abandoning the posture of the perpetual victim and embracing the responsibility of being the architect of one's own life. Even when circumstances are genuinely oppressive, even when obstacles are real and significant, there remains a space of agency where we can choose how to respond, what attitude to adopt, what meaning to assign to experience. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Nazi concentration camps, testified that even under the most extreme conditions of deprivation and brutality, human beings still possess the ultimate freedom to choose their inner attitude. This does not trivialize suffering or justify injustice, but acknowledges the indomitable power of the human spirit. The iron rod of the psalm represents this capacity to exercise dominion over the inner world, even when the outer world is out of control. It means developing discipline to regulate emotions, train attention, cultivate virtues, and pursue long-term goals despite short-term difficulties. To a person living in material poverty, this message may seem insensitive if interpreted superficially, as if we were saying that material circumstances do not matter, that a positive attitude alone will solve everything. That would be both false and cruel. Material circumstances matter enormously. Access to adequate nutrition, safe housing, quality education, healthcare. All of these are basic human needs, and their absence causes real suffering. But Psalm 2 operates at a different level than socioeconomic analysis. It is not prescribing economic policy, but mapping universal psychological dynamics. Even while fighting to change material circumstances, even while engaging in legitimate social activism, the individual still faces the task of maintaining psychological integrity, of not allowing external oppression to destroy the internal sense of dignity and agency. This is the difference between the resilience that enables sustained resistance and the collapse that leads to paralyzing despair. History is full of examples of individuals who faced brutal circumstances yet maintained inner sovereignty, which eventually enabled not only personal survival, but transformation of broader conditions. Nelson Mandela spent decades in prison, but used that time not to stew in self-pity, but to cultivate qualities of character that ultimately empowered him to lead a nation through an extraordinarily difficult transition. Malala Yousafzai, shot by extremists for defending girls' education, transformed trauma into a platform for global advocacy. These are not superhumans with special powers, but people who cultivated inner strength through specific practices of self-discipline, connection to transcendent purpose, and refusal to be defined by circumstances. Psalm 2 encodes the psychological principles that make such transformations possible. For the middle class, the challenges are different but no less real. The main temptation is not the despair of material deprivation, but the anesthesia of mediocre comfort. It is possible to live an entire life in a state of comfortable distraction, never confronting deep questions of meaning and purpose, simply sliding from one social obligation to another. Work pays the bills but does not engage passion. Relationships are functional but not deep. Entertainment fills free time but does not nourish the soul. There is a perpetual sense that real life is always about to begin, but somehow never does. Psalm 2 confronts this half-alive existence with urgency. Now therefore, be wise. There is not unlimited time. The life you are living now is the only life you have. The rebellion that needs to be confronted may not be against an obvious external tyranny, but against the more subtle tyranny of internalized expectations, fear of others' judgment, and preference for familiar safety over unknown possibility. Establishing inner sovereignty in this context means having the courage to question the life script written by others, to explore territories of meaning and possibility that may be uncomfortable, but authentic, to build a life that is a genuine expression of one's unique values and aspirations rather than conformity to prefabricated models. For the upper class, paradoxically, the challenges may be even more acute, because abundant material resources create the illusion that the deeper problems of meaning can be solved through acquisition and experience. Yet, as philosophers from Buddha to Schopenhauer recognized, satisfying material desires does not produce lasting happiness. It only generates new desires in an endless cycle. A person who has everything money can buy but lacks transcendent purpose often experiences a more acute existential emptiness than someone still struggling for basic needs. Psalm 2 offers an antidote to this emptiness in the form of submission to transcendent authority. Not the authority of another human or institution, but the authority of principles and values recognized as legitimately superior to personal whims. This may mean dedicating resources not only to accumulating more comfort, but to causes that serve the greater good. It may mean using privilege not for isolation, but for advocacy on behalf of the voiceless. It may mean embracing spiritual disciplines that cultivate interior depth rather than simply chasing the next extravagant experience. The symbolic dimension of Psalm 2 extends far beyond individual applications to illuminate collective and political dynamics. The image of nations raging against the established order resonates powerfully throughout human history. Every revolution, every reform movement, every challenge to the status quo recapitulates this archetypal pattern. The crucial question is how to distinguish between legitimate rebellion against unjust order and destructive rebellion against order itself. This distinction is not always clear and requires careful moral discernment. The American founding fathers, who rebelled against the British Crown, justified their actions by appealing to transcendent principles of natural rights and the consent of the governed. They were not rejecting government as such, but asserting the right to a government that respected fundamental human dignity. Contrast this with revolutionary movements that promise to destroy every existing structure without articulating a clear vision of an alternative order. Such movements invariably degenerate into chaotic violence because there is no organizing principle to replace what was destroyed. Psalm 2 also illuminates the nature of legitimate authority in terms that transcend specific political arrangements. The figure of the anointed represents authority derived not from brute power or military conquest, but from alignment with a transcendent order of meaning and justice. This is a revolutionary principle that undermines all forms of tyranny. No human ruler can claim absolute obedience because all human rulers are subject to standards of justice that transcend them. This was the fundamental insight that animated the tradition of natural law and human rights, which eventually challenged slavery, defended religious freedom, and established limits upon governmental power. The anointed of the psalm is not an autocrat wielding power arbitrarily, but a representative of divine order who is bound by that order just as much as the subjects are. This understanding of limited and accountable authority is an extraordinary civilizational achievement that must not be taken for granted. But the psalm also acknowledges an uncomfortable reality that contemporary utopian fantasies often deny. Order requires force to be maintained. The iron rod is not merely a metaphor, but a recognition that there are destructive forces, both internal and external, that cannot be persuaded or negotiated with, but must be subdued. On a social level, this corresponds to the need for criminal justice institutions, for security forces capable of protecting the innocent from predators, for the willingness to defend civilization against threats that seek to destroy it. The pacifist illusion that love and dialogue can resolve all conflicts is both naive and dangerous. There are individuals and movements driven not by misunderstandings that can be corrected through better communication, but by psychological pathologies or ideological commitments that make them impervious to reason. Dealing with such threats requires force and a willingness to use it decisively. This is not a celebration of violence, but a realistic recognition that the alternative to proportional and limited force is not universal peace, but the victory of more brutal forces. This tension between mercy and justice, compassion and strength, forgiveness and accountability runs throughout the wisdom tradition and remains a central dilemma of political and personal ethics. Psalm 2 does not resolve this dilemma once and for all, but maps it in archetypal terms that remain relevant. There is a time for negotiation and a time for decisive confrontation. There are situations in which patience is a virtue and situations in which patience is complicity. Discerning which is which requires practical wisdom that cannot be reduced to simple formulas, but must be cultivated through experience, reflection, and openness to transcendent guidance. The journey mapped by Psalm 2 is not linear or simple. It is not a matter of applying 3 easy steps and achieving instant enlightenment. It is a lifelong process involving advances and setbacks, victories and defeats, clarity and confusion. The rebellion of the nations does not happen once and then end, but is a perpetual temptation to deny structure, reject responsibility, and seek escape in fantasy or distraction. The need to reestablish inner sovereignty, to reconnect with a transcendent source of meaning, to exercise discipline over chaotic impulses. This need recurs daily. The psalm recognizes this in its dramatic structure, which offers no final definitive resolution, but a cycle of conflict, divine affirmation, proclamation of authority, and exhortation to submission, a cycle that invites continual reenactment. This cyclical quality makes the text particularly well suited for repeated liturgical use. Each time the psalm is recited or sung, participants have the opportunity to re-engage the psychological and spiritual dynamics it maps, to examine where they currently stand in relation to the forces of chaos and order in their own lives, to renew their commitment to the project of individuation and integration. In Jewish and Christian traditions, the Psalms have been used in this way for millennia, not as texts to be studied once and then shelved, but as spiritual technologies to be employed repeatedly to shape consciousness and character. The wisdom of this practice is being rediscovered by contemporary psychologists who recognize the value of regular rituals, meditative practices, and recitation of meaningful texts for the development and maintenance of psychological health. To translate this into accessible contemporary practice, we might imagine something like a daily reflective meditation structured around the dynamics of Psalm 2. Such a practice could begin with an examination of conscience. Where today did I experience rebellion against the order I ought to honor? Where did I allow chaotic voices in my mind to conspire against my integrity? Where did I fail to exercise appropriate dominion over destructive impulses? This phase corresponds to the Psalm's first section, which maps the conspiracy of the nations. The second phase would involve a deliberate shift of perspective. How would the situations that frustrated me today appear from a transcendent viewpoint? What seems dramatic to me? Is it really so significant in the larger scheme of things? Can I find elements of humor or absurdity in my inflated self-importance? This phase corresponds to the divine laughter in the psalm. The third phase would involve the reaffirmation of identity and purpose. Who am I truly, in my best and most authentic self? What principles do I choose to honor? What legacy do I seek to build? This phase corresponds to the Anointed's proclamation of his divine sonship. The final phase would involve practical commitment. What specific step can I take tomorrow to align my behavior with the identity and values I affirm? Where do I need to exercise discipline? Where do I need to exercise mercy? This phase corresponds to the Psalm's final exhortation to serve with fear and rejoice with trembling. Such a practice need not be religious in the traditional sense to be effective. Its effectiveness derives from how it structures attention and reflection in a way that facilitates psychological integration. Research in psychology shows that regular reflective practices, especially when structured around values and long-term goals, correlate with multiple indicators of well-being, including greater life satisfaction, better emotional regulation, more satisfying relationships, and increased perseverance in the face of challenges. Psalm 2 offers a time-tested framework for such reflection, a framework that carries the accumulated wisdom of generations who have wrestled with fundamental questions of identity, authority, order, and chaos. The relevance of the psalm for confronting chaos deserves even deeper exploration. We live in an age characterized by extraordinary levels of complexity and change. Social structures that once seemed permanent are rapidly dissolving. Technologies are transforming work and communication in ways we barely understand. Information flows inundate us with contradictory data. Political polarization fractures social consensus. Climate change threatens ecological stability. Confronted with all this, the temptation is to succumb to paralyzing anxiety or desperate cynicism. But Psalm 2 offers an alternative. To recognize that external chaos makes it even more urgent to establish internal order. When the world around us is disintegrating, the need for a stable psychological center becomes a matter of survival. This is not a call to escapism or isolation. It is not a suggestion to ignore real problems or retreat into private interiority while the world burns. It is the recognition that our ability to respond effectively to external chaos depends crucially on having established inner sovereignty. A psychologically fragmented person, dominated by anxiety and reactive to every stimulus, cannot contribute constructively to solving collective problems. Such a person becomes part of the chaos, adding more noise to the signal. By contrast, an individual who has cultivated inner strength, who has established a clear hierarchy of values, who has developed the capacity to regulate emotions and maintain focus on long-term goals, such an individual can be a stabilizing force amid turbulence. They can think clearly when others panic. They can act decisively when others are paralyzed. They can maintain compassion when others harden into tribalism. Psalm 2, then, is not merely an ancient text of historical interest, but a perennial technology of human development. It encodes in poetic and symbolic language psychological principles that remain valid regardless of specific cultural context. The tension between chaos and order, between rebellion and submission, between fragmentation and integration, between dissolution and sovereignty. This tension is universal to the human condition. Every generation, every culture, every individual must navigate these waters. The psalm offers a map not of a specific territory, but of the universal structures that underlie all territories. It does not tell us exactly what decisions to make in specific situations, but directs our attention to the psychological and spiritual dynamics we must consider when making those decisions. The Psalm's final promise, "Blessed are all who take refuge in him," is not a promise of an easy life or guaranteed worldly success. History is full of people who aligned themselves with transcendent principles yet suffered terribly. Martyrs who died for their convictions, reformers persecuted for challenging injustice, prophets rejected for speaking inconvenient truths. The blessedness the psalm promises is not material prosperity or physical safety, but something deeper. Psychological integrity that enables one to sustain meaning even in the face of suffering, peace that transcends external circumstances, fundamental confidence that the universe possesses a structure of meaning even when we cannot fully discern it. This is a form of blessedness that no external circumstance can destroy, because it does not depend on external circumstance. It is the fruit of inner alignment with ultimate reality. We arrive, then, at the transformative synthesis that Psalm 2 offers. The journey it maps is not an escape from reality, but a deeper penetration into it. It is not a denial of chaos, but an honest confrontation with it and the development of the capacity to face it without being dissolved by it. It is not a rejection of authority, but the recognition that authentic authority derives from connection with a transcendent order of meaning and justice. It is not passivity in the face of injustice, but the cultivation of inner strength that enables sustained resistance. It is not narcissistic individualism, but genuine individuation that recognizes that mature autonomy coexists with responsible interdependence. It is not arrogant certainty, but humble confidence in a source of meaning that transcends us. It is not a life without struggle, but a life with the resources to make the struggle meaningful. The path the psalm illuminates is narrow and arduous. It requires brutal honesty about one's own limitations and failures. It requires courage to confront chaotic forces, both external and internal. It requires discipline to subordinate immediate impulses to long-term purposes. It requires humility to recognize that we are not the center of the universe. It requires faith to trust in an order of meaning we cannot fully control. But this path, however difficult, is the only path to a truly human life, a life that transcends mere biological survival and reaches dimensions of meaning, purpose, and dignity. It is the path of genuine psychological differentiation, of developing true inner strength, of establishing real emotional sovereignty. It is the path that Psalm 2 maps with extraordinary clarity for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. And it is a path open to every human being, regardless of material circumstances or social status, because it is a path of interior transformation that no external force can finally prevent. Blessed are all who take refuge in him, not because their lives will be easy, but because their lives will have a meaning that no adversity can destroy, because they will have established a foundation no storm can shake, because they will have found a center no chaos can displace. This is the promise and the challenge of Psalm 2. a perpetual invitation to embrace the journey of becoming fully human, fully alive, fully sovereign amid the inevitable chaos of existence.